Titanic was called the Ship of Dreams.
No, it wasn't. Never once. We all know the story of Titanic. Or do we? As the tale has continued to be retold in movies, documentaries, and, hey, even YouTube videos, dozens of myths, misconceptions, and misinformation have snuck into the narrative, and the uncomfortable truth is that a lot of what normal people who aren't obsessive nerds like my friends and I know about the ship is just straight up wrong. I call them zombie myths. They've been busted before, and they should be dead. But as new generations of Titanic enthusiasts enter the fold, they're immersed in the rabbit hole of books and films and docos. That's Australian for documentaries, by the way. And they learn all of this garbage all over again, and the cycle continues. Zombie myths. The truth is, none of this is new. This book was released within weeks of the sinking, and already it was beginning to peddle hearsay and stories, myths of all kinds. But as AI has kind of begun to take over online discourse around historic events like Titanic, it just means that fake facts can be spread quicker than ever. So today, let's look at 3 of the most annoying, persistent myths that refuse to die. From the infamous missing binoculars to the Titanic's attempted speed record, and the tiny rudder that supposedly doomed it all. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and today, let's become insufferable know-it-alls. Strip these stories bare as somebody wearing only the heart of the ocean, and bust some of the most frustrating Titanic myths. One of the most common myths about the Titanic disaster surrounds the ship's binoculars, or glasses, as they're also known, and whether they could have enabled the lookouts to spot the iceberg early enough for Titanic's officers to take evasive action and avoid the collision. Now, this was certainly the viewpoint of Mr. Frederick Fleet, the lookout who had first spotted the iceberg on the horizon and insisted in his testimony before the subsequent inquiries that glasses would have made the difference. That night, Fleet and his fellow lookout, Reginald Lee, had peered into the darkness, their eyes smarting and streaming from the exceptional cold and that 21-odd knot headwind. Then ahead was spotted a patch of exceptional darkness with a complete lack of stars within. It could only be a solid object. Fleet rang the ship's bell. He phoned the bridge, and the rest is history. Fleet and Lee were both crucial witnesses at the inquiries because, after all, they had both seen the iceberg first. So let's stop for a minute here and actually talk binoculars. Sure, Titanic's lookouts testified that while en route from Belfast to Southampton, on the ship's delivery voyage, there had been a pair of glasses provided to them by the ship's original second officer, David Blair. Marked with the words Second Officer SS Titanic, these glasses were returned to Blair's cabin and locked up in a cabinet upon arrival in Southampton by lookout George Hogg. So it seemed prudent for them to seek out the second officer again to ask where the glasses were after leaving Southampton. But a famous reshuffling of the ship's senior officers in Southampton led to David Blair being relieved as Titanic's second officer, with Charles Lightoller stepping into his position. So when lookout Simons inquired about the glasses with Lightoller, he had no idea. Lightoller asked Chief Officer Wilde, who replied that there were none provided to him. Lightoller relayed this information back to Simons, who passed word along to his crewmates. Lookout Hogg also made an inquiry after leaving Queenstown and claimed to have asked about glasses several times during the voyage, but he too was unsuccessful. There was an expectation amongst Titanic's lookouts that there would be glasses provided to them during the voyage based on their experiences aboard other White Star ships. Fleet, for example, had served as a lookout aboard the Oceanic for 4 years prior and testified that there had always been glasses available for the lookout's use, as did his fellow Oceanic and Titanic shipmates, Thomas Jones, George Simons, and Archie Jewell, while lookout George Hogg said the same for his time aboard Adriatic. Though kept in the crow's nest during the voyage, the glasses would then be returned to the officers' quarters once they arrived in port. They were expensive, precious instruments after all, so they couldn't just be left lying around. Now, this was not exactly a company-wide policy, per se. Lightoller even detailed the inventory of glasses that were aboard Titanic. A pair for the captain, one for each senior officer, and a pair that remained on the bridge at all times, referred to as pilot glasses. J. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line, said that it was up to the captain's discretion, but a set of glasses would be provided for the lookouts if a commander requested it, while Lightoller stated that the officer on watch could also make that decision. Now, it seems common logic that lookouts should have access to binoculars, but the truth is that they could actually prove to sometimes be more trouble than they were worth. In the testimony of one captain, Richard Jones, of the Dominion Line's SS Canada, he pointed out that the glasses were difficult to focus, and if not properly done so, the lookout might as well be looking through, quote, a blank tube. On top of that, Master Mariner Edward G. Cannons said that in his 25 years of experience on the North Atlantic route, he found binoculars were terrible because they easily blurred. So, what were binoculars actually used for? Well, a ship's lookout's most valuable tool was his eyes. In fact, unlike other contemporary shipping lines, the White Star Line actually had dedicated lookouts who were even paid extra for their work. In the days of sail, ships' lookouts could spot a small white blur over the horizon and almost immediately determine if the sailing ship over there was a friend or foe, what country it was from, or even what ship it was specifically just from the canvas it had set. The lookout's role was to spot hazards. That could be done with his eyes. But if something was spotted and he didn't know what it was, then binoculars could help define it from a distance. But scanning the horizon with binoculars for an entire shift, or a watch, was not a good idea. You'd be limiting your field of view immensely, and as Captain Jones said, to essentially a small tube, which is the exact opposite of what you'd want a lookout with keen eyesight to be doing. Titanic's second officer Lightoller, who also felt that glasses were detrimental to the lookouts, said that in instances where there was no light, like on the night of the disaster, one spots ice with their naked eyes first and then reports it to the bridge before examining it with binoculars. Even Fleet agreed that you'd first have to spot an object with the unaided eye before examining closer with glasses. The general consensus among the experts and captains brought before the American and British inquiries was that binoculars were meant for the more experienced eyes of the officers on the bridge rather than the lookouts in the crow's nest. In fact, Oceanic's captain, Bertram Fox Hayes, stated that the lookout man, when he sees a light, if he has glasses, is more liable to look at it and see what kind of ship it is. That is the officer's business. The lookout man's business is to look out for other lights. So why did the myth that glasses could have saved Titanic come to be a thing in the first place? Well, we can probably trace its origins to Lookout Fleet's original testimony, because he was being unjustly grilled for his role in the collision, and naturally the question was, on a perfectly clear night, why hadn't the lookouts seen the thing earlier? This is really unfair, because although it was clear, it was extremely dark, and the horizon blended almost perfectly into the sky. It would have made spotting ice an extremely difficult proposition. In fact, Fleet and Lee had another surprising fact working against them. Being so high up in the crow's nest on the mast, they were looking down at the ice ahead where it might blend in neatly with the black of the ocean. If lookouts had been also posted to the prow, the very front of the ship, they would have had a better chance at seeing ice against the horizon. Naturally, at the inquiry, poor Fleet and Lee, who never really had much chance at all of being able to spot the ice, had to play up the difficulties in seeing that night, Lee seemingly inventing a haze, and Fleet blaming the lack of binoculars. Asked about the matter, Fleet said we, quote, could have seen it a bit sooner. Soon enough, he said, to probably get out of the way. And honestly, I can't really blame them for trying to cover their backs. That's a lot of heat to be copping during a massive international investigation for a disaster that they really had both very little ability to prevent. It's thought that they spotted the iceberg with way less than a minute to spare before collision, but that's not their fault. Should binoculars have been supplied to the lookouts at all times? Probably yes. It stands to reason. If you have men whose job it is to identify hazards, then they should be equipped with every tool at their disposal. But would it have made a difference that night? Most likely, probably not. The lookouts would not have been standing there scanning the horizon with binoculars. That's just not how they worked. In my opinion, it would have been more prudent for Captain Smith and the senior officers actually on the watch to post lookouts forward at the prow. They were headed into an area they knew was likely to have ice, and experience told them a moonless night would make bergs harder to see. By contrast, when Carpathia's captain, Rostron, sent his ship careening through the night to Titanic's rescue, he posted a dozen men forward, with a pair at the prow, to scan for bergs. And it's a good thing they did too, because Carpathia spent much of that night dodging the things left and right on their way. I really think that if two men had been posted up forward, then the berg could have been spotted at least a few seconds earlier, and that might have been all that was needed to clear the ice and avoid a collision entirely. But that's neither here nor there. Did a lack of binoculars cause the Titanic disaster? No. Myth busted. This next one is so integral to the Titanic legend, it's basically entered the public record as fact. That they were trying to set a speed record on Titanic's maiden voyage, recklessly travelling at full speed in the vicinity of a massive ice field. Well, let's start with the first part of the myth, that Titanic was trying to break the speed record. Now, this is pretty well known, but it has to be stated flat out that neither Titanic or Olympic were ever going to beat the speed records set by their competition, the 26-knot Cunard liners Mauretania and Lusitania. Harland & Wolff naval architect Edward Wilding said that under peak performance, Titanic could possibly have attained a speed of 23¼ knots. Now, this is pretty impressive for a ship with triple expansion steam engines like Titanic, but the fact is, Cunard just had faster ships, and the White Star Line was okay with that. Titanic's surviving officers, of course, denied that they were attempting to set any records, insisting that the maximum speed Titanic reached during her voyage was about 21 to 21½ knots. Now, the American inquiry concluded that Titanic's speed reached at least 21, but no more than 24.5 knots, and for his part, Bruce Ismay only expected Titanic to match Olympic's 22 knots, never thinking she could exceed that speed. But an infamous, supposedly overheard conversation between Ismay and Captain Smith in Titanic's D-deck reception room on the Saturday afternoon, April 13th, would only add fuel to the fire. The conversation was described in October 1913 testimony by first-class passenger Elizabeth Lynes during the limitation of liability hearings. She recounted how her interest had been piqued as the men began to discuss Titanic's performance and the ship's run, or how many miles she'd travelled over the course of a day, as there was a daily pool where passengers bet on the ship's progress over the previous 24 hours. By her account, Ismay dominated the conversation, commenting positively on Titanic's performance, which had been getting better and better with each day. Without ever asking Smith questions on the subject, he stated confidently, apparently, that Titanic was performing better than Olympic during her debut the previous year. This culminated in Ismay dramatically bringing his hand down on the arm of his chair as he declared Titanic could beat the Olympic's maiden voyage run and get into New York on Tuesday night, as opposed to Wednesday morning, as had been planned. Now, in many of the retellings of this conversation, Ismay has been portrayed as bullish and dictatorial about the operation of his ship, exerting his company chairman authority over Captain Smith. But Ismay is a more complex character than the cartoon villain he's often portrayed as. He comes off, in almost all his interactions, as an excited marketer, very proud of his creations. In the conversation with Smith, it seems more likely he was expressing his astonishment and enthusiasm about Titanic's better-than-expected daily runs and exceptional performance. Now, Ismay did meet with Chief Engineer Bell after leaving Queenstown on April 11th to discuss the supply of coal. A recent strike had wreaked havoc on the industry, and Bell encouraged them to economise their fuel supply, and he affirmed that Titanic wouldn't arrive before Wednesday. But, if weather permitted, Ismay suggested that they could run the ship at full speed for a few hours on Monday or Tuesday. Now, this would not have been done without the captain's approval though, and Ismay maintained that at no point did he insist or demand that Smith increase Titanic's speed. Titanic was not out to set a speed record, she just couldn't do it. But was Titanic out to get into New York earlier than expected? Well, calculations by researchers maintain that an average speed of 22 knots could have put Titanic in New York before 9 PM on the Tuesday night. Ismay was a man well in tune with the power of public relations. After all, the weather had held, the sea was unusually calm, and the night quite clear. Titanic's engines were running well. Captain Smith and Engineer Bell didn't survive the disaster, so we don't know their side of the story. But it's not outside the realms of possibility that the pair had discussed the progress their ship was making and planned to pass the Ambrose lightship on Tuesday evening. In fact, there was even precedent for it. Olympic's arrivals on Tuesday evenings even became a bone of contention between Ismay and other company officials. That is dramatically demonstrated in a lively exchange of letters that show Ismay may have actually been worn down over time to accepting the earlier arrivals as norm instead of pushing for them. At the inquiries, Ismay maintained that early arrivals were bad for business, that it could upset passenger plans and muddle things up, and private correspondence between him and the other big players within the company suggests that he really did think so. But over time, others might have worked hard to change his mind. It's demonstrated in a frankly bizarre series of letters that show exactly how the attitude to speed and early arrivals was shaped within the company. These letters are critical in understanding the dynamic inside the White Star Line and Ismay's role and opinions, so I'm going to read them out almost in full, but if you want to skip ahead, here's the timestamp to go to. In summer 1911, Ismay had written to the head of the White Star's US presence, Philip Franklin. He said, "Your strong recommendation that the Olympic on her next voyage should be allowed to dock on Tuesday evening will receive consideration, and I note you say that she could have done this easily on her last voyage. I do not quite gather whether your recommendation goes so far as to advocate our always attempting to land passengers on Tuesday. Perhaps you'll let me hear from you on this. I at once admit that docking on Tuesday evening would help you in turning the ship around and give those on board a better chance of getting the ship in good shape for the Saturday sailing, and further, that if we could make it a practice to do this, it would please the passengers. But, as I have repeatedly stated, I feel very strongly that passengers would be far more satisfied to know when they left here that they would not land until Wednesday morning, rather than be in a state of uncertainty in regard to this for the whole of the trip. I do not think you can have ever experienced the miseries of a night landing in New York. Had you done so, I think your views might be altered." I'm going to read some more of these letters out because they're really, really interesting. This next one is actually quite funny. Franklin was obviously on Ismay's back about the Tuesday night arrivals. In frustration, Ismay wrote back, "I am afraid if you keep on writing me much more in regard to the Olympic docking in New York on Tuesday evening, I shall have to reply to you in the same manner as you did to Mr. Curry when he kept finding fault with the stamp of fireman you were supplying to the American Line steamers at New York." Sassy. At last, it seems, Ismay eventually gave in. He wrote, "As you are aware, I am not favourably disposed to trying to land passengers on Tuesday afternoon. But if, after talking the matter over with Lord Pirrie, Captain Smith and Mr. Bell, the consensus of opinions is in favour of this being done, you may rest assured I will not allow my individual feeling to stand in the way." That was July 31st, 1911. Now, just over a week later, Captain Smith received this cable. "Dear Sir, we confirm the verbal instructions given to you at Southampton last week that it will be right for you to go full speed when on the short track, subject to your considering it prudent and in the interests of safe navigation to do so. This instruction applies to both eastbound and westbound voyages when on the short track." Fred Toppin, who oversaw operations in New York for the White Star Line, wrote to Ismay that early arrivals would help a lot to speed up turn down and refueling times and, quote, "add materially to her attractiveness and popularity on this side." On August 19th, 1911, Franklin wrote to Ismay saying he was sorry the Olympic did not manage to dock on a Tuesday evening that voyage. Ismay's reply is shockingly sarcastic and very telling. "Your sorrow," he wrote, "that the Olympic did not dock on Tuesday night last voyage will, I hope, be mitigated by her docking on Tuesday this voyage, as we have just received a cable that at 9 o'clock last night she was 271 miles east of Nantucket, which we calculate would make her due at Ambrose Channel at 6 o'clock tonight. And I presume she will get up to the dock at about 10 o'clock, which will make an extremely comfortable landing for her passengers, and I am sure they will much prefer this to dawdling away time and landing on Wednesday morning, to say nothing of their having had the pleasant uncertainty from the time they left here as to whether they would land on Tuesday evening or not." You really have to ask yourself, does this sound like the man who'd be putting pressure on Captain Smith to arrive early on Titanic's maiden voyage? Bearing in mind, this is just 8 months after he'd penned that almost rebuke-like letter to Franklin. Either Ismay did a hard 180 on his own opinion, or he just decided to step away from the whole thing, let Smith and Bell to their affairs, and carry on promoting his ship to his passengers. So, why did Titanic end up screaming through the night in a known area of ice at nearly full speed? Assuming Smith and Bell had conferred and agreed that a Tuesday night arrival should be tried for, They'd have got no objection from Ismay, that much had been made clear by the guy who just wanted to wash his hands of the whole thing. Smith had been told that it will be right for you to go full speed when on the short track, subject to your considering it prudent and in the interests of safe navigation to do so. This is a tricky one to answer because in some ways hindsight is 2020. It has to be said that, at the time, it was standard operating practice on the North Atlantic run. It was just common practice to maintain speed if there was clear weather ahead, and while extra precautions could be taken, whether it be posting additional lookouts like we talked about earlier, or maintaining extra alertness for hazards on the horizon, there are a few reasons for this. One of the more practical ones for maintaining speed is that a ship at its maximum speed is more easy to control because she's got good headway and flow over the rudder. The ship will just be more responsive to the helm, the wheel. They don't turn like cars. Ships point their noses where they need to go, and it takes a little while for their momentum to bleed off and haul them in that direction. Keeping speed up generally means a more responsive vessel, but 21 knots is far more than simply keeping headway on the ship. The fact is, the night was unusually clear, eerily so. In all the most experienced officers' long careers, it's unlikely they'd ever seen it like that before. Captain Smith was presented with a kind of strange situation. It was dark and moonless, sure, but clear. In fog or bad visibility, it was common practice for the ship to slow down, put on every light and blast the whistle regularly. But on a perfectly clear night? It was up to him. Smith decided to press on, and before turning in for bed, he made it clear that should a haze come on, if the visibility be impacted at all, then he should be woken up to assess the situation. The simple fact is that virtually all big ships back then tore through the night if it was clear. This was testified to not just by Titanic's officers in the British inquiry, but the various ship commanders, both retired and active, who provided expert testimony. Now, no doubt there was a bit of professional pride at play here. The loss of Smith and his ship was an indictment on virtually the entire British merchant marine, so it's not surprising that captains rushed to his defence. But even Captain Rostron, the heroic commander of the Carpathia, said that this is how he had operated, and he was known for being a very cautious and calculating skipper. They'd based their opinion on their decades of experience on the sea, and again, what Smith could and probably should have done is post extra lookouts, especially forward. So, no, Titanic wasn't trying to set a speed record. Even if the crew had been trying to get in on Tuesday night, it wasn't really that unusual because Olympic had done it plenty of times before. Bruce Ismay, the usual villain of the story, was apparently opposed to the whole thing, and maintaining speed in clear conditions was also just common practice. Nothing points to either Titanic's officers or owners as driving the ship unusually hard to make headlines or stray outside the realms of convention for the times. It was just a convention that would prove tragically short-sighted. Myth busted. We'll end on a more technical one, because you know I love technical things. Titanic's rudder. It stood stories tall, but for decades has been blamed for the collision under the assumption it was still too small for a ship of its size. Let's jump in. First, a bit about the rudder itself. The thing was enormous. It stood 78 feet, or 24 meters tall. That's about the height of a 6 or 7 story apartment block. And by itself, it weighed 101.25 tons. The immense weight was thanks to its heavy construction. In modern ships, the rudder is usually hollow, but Titanic's huge rudder itself was made up of 5 massive, solid, mild steel casted sections coupled together by strong bolt flanges with forged bolts 2 to 3.5 inches, almost 9 centimeters in diameter. That's what held them all together. Securing this enormous assembly to the ship was no easy task. 7 nickel steel pintles and corresponding gudgeons, kind of like a giant hinge, held its huge 101.25 ton weight and gave it the required axis for turning. Cast into the gudgeons on the hull attached to the ship were 2 rudder stoppers, which would basically prevent the rudder physically from swinging wildly out of control. It limited the turning angle of the rudder to 40 degrees. Any further could create massive and sudden drag, damaging the ship's turning machinery and possibly even shearing the rudder itself straight off. So despite this impressive piece of engineering, was Titanic's rudder not large enough for her size? Well, Let's start with how proper rudder size is determined. The usual method is to compare the area of the rudder to the longitudinal area of the ship's hull on the center line. Taking into account the different formulas used at the time to calculate rudder area, it should have been a ratio somewhere between 0.014 at a minimum, up to about 2% of the hull area. Now, fortunately, a very clever chap named Captain Charles B. Weeks has calculated all of this for us over on Encyclopedia Titanica. Let's see here, Titanic's length between perpendiculars was 850 feet, her draft was 34.5 feet, when multiplied together gives us 29,325 feet squared, that's 28,870 feet squared when we subtract the cutaway at the front of the hull. Using the ratios and percentage range that we talked about earlier, Titanic's rudder should have a surface area somewhere between 412 and 577.4 square feet. So, how did Titanic's actual rudder match up to these calculations? Well, to figure out the actual area of the rudder fitted to Titanic, we need to use a set of rules referred to as Simpson's rules, which have been used by naval architects to calculate the area of irregular shapes. And rudders, well, they certainly have a variety of shapes. Using Simpson's rule, the surface area of Titanic's rudder comes out to somewhere around 401.63 feet squared. Now, this is just under 11 feet short of the minimum area range that we talked about earlier. So Titanic's rudder was technically slightly smaller than the results of the calculations. Surprise, I bet you thought I was going to say this myth was totally busted. It kind of is, but let me explain. When it comes to rudders, size isn't everything. Obviously, if the rudder is tragically undersized, then it wouldn't do too well. But would 11 square feet have made an enormous difference the night Titanic met the iceberg? Well, it's hard to say exactly, but the rudder's size didn't seem to greatly affect the handling of the ship. Titanic's quartermaster, Robert Hitchens, remembered that she was a good steering ship, and Francis Carruthers, a member of the Board of Trade, and a marine engineer, commented how noticeably small Titanic's turning circles were during her sea trials. Now, placement of a rudder can have a huge impact on its effectiveness. Unlike the four-funneled Cunarders with two screws on either side of the rudder, the designers of the Olympic class went with one propeller on either side and a third on the rudder's centerline, just forward of it. Now, this creates a slipstream of water flowing past the rudder, increasing its effectiveness. You would think that if the rudder was an issue, then its design would have been changed on her later sister, Britannic, and her earlier sister, Olympic, but both of these ships were fitted with the same design. Captain Bertram Fox Hayes, who commanded the Olympic for 6 years, including a wartime service, felt that the steamer was the finest ship that had ever been built. Her steering capabilities were apparently good enough to perform zigzag maneuvers to evade enemy submarines, and in the case of the U-103, she maneuvered so effectively she was able to avoid the attack and then ram and sink the sub. Titanic was no lumbering, clumsy giant. She was fairly nimble for a vessel of her size, and all indicators are that she and her sisters steered very well and responded to helm commands from the bridge. But the collision with the iceberg is unusual because it was, in theory, just ever so slight. It's not known exactly how big the iceberg was or how it was shaped underwater, but it appears to have been a very slight impact, meaning that Titanic, in the short time between the sighting of the ice and the impact itself, almost made it. Simulations might give us some idea of how much difference an oversized or exactly sized rudder, with at least that missing 11 square feet added, might make. Could it have meant Titanic might miss the berg by mere inches? Well, to figure that out, we'd need to ask marine engineers, and fortunately, I know just the guy. Dr. Stephen Payne has designed a great many ships, including the Queen Mary too. I asked him about this conundrum, and he had a very interesting take on it. There are a lot of unknowns, the size and the shape of the iceberg below the waterline, for example, but given Titanic apparently just grazed the berg, Stephen says, the margin may have been so slim that an extra 11 square feet of rudder area could, this is very much playing in the realms of hypothetical here, have made the difference. In his professional opinion, things could have played out very differently. Remember when we mentioned Titanic's central propeller washed directly over the rudder? Well, it's thought that when the ice was spotted, her bridge crew had rung down to stop the engines, and that central propeller came to a standstill. Because it was a flat plate, Stephen says, rather than an aerofoil as we'd use now, it was rather inefficient. In fact, much of the turning force normally would be generated by the directed thrust from the center propellers. As steam to this had been cut off, it would have started coasting and would have begun to slow down. In any case, Stephen continues, it would not have been providing the maximum amount of thrust. So the conjecture is, what if they'd kept the turbine energized? With the slight extra kick that the center propeller could have given, eased the stern around. It's a tantalizing question, one we'll probably never know the answer to. But it would appear, to Dr. Payne, that Titanic's rudder size might, given those exceptional circumstances, have made a difference. Myth busted? Not exactly. How's that for a plot twist? Look, there's no way that any one of these factors led to Titanic's demise. It's a story with so many layers and multiple failure points that just all happen to align in the kind of Swiss cheese model that air investigators talk about. Titanic's rudder was, technically, too small, and it could, in the event, and speaking purely theoretically, have made the difference that night. But did Titanic sink because its rudder was too small? No way, I don't think so. Titanic's story is a breeding ground for wild and wacky conspiracy theories and myths, everything from the curse of a mummy travelling in the cargo holds to the raging coal fire apparently consuming the ship from within, weakening it so that simply touching the iceberg was enough to send her below. Join me next time as we once again dive on in and try to bust some of the most egregious zombie myths about Titanic that refuse to die.